I'm just going to introduce Dr. Brian Olson, who's the department head in the Department of Agriculture, Agribusiness and Agricultural Economics, and he's going to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Cardwell.
Thanks, Martin. Wonderful to see so many people here, graduate students, people from the industry, and so welcome. I'm very pleased to introduce Ryan Cardwell. Ryan's an incredibly interesting, creative, and productive person in both the University of Manitoba life and his personal interest. How many of us, for example, have traveled to both North Korea and Rwanda? Is there anyone who's been to both those places? That likely is a fairly unique piece. Ryan's professional interests are widespread, usually focusing on some aspect of policy and food aid. And he started at the University of Manitoba in 2005. And the seminar today is based on a paper that he did with Chad Lawley relating consumer income and Canada's supply management system. And you'll be looking and talking questions and so on that. And so I'd like to just sort of slip and give, particularly those of our own faculty and graduate students, a little background in terms of Ryan, because one of the things that we've become much more aware of is those of us in different disciplines really have to get to know each other a lot better, and I think that this has been a big, a big sort of push off our current dean, is provide us with that opportunity to look at areas where we can collaborate, and unless we know each other, we likely won't do as much as we otherwise would. And so I'm going to use this opportunity to give you a little bit of background in terms of Ryan's background. And one of the things I'd like to say is two things highlight Ryan. He's very positive and he's always learning. And the two things about that is number one, in terms of learning, he had his first, he and his wife had their first child in the last 18 months. And if that isn't a learning experience, I don't know what is. But the second thing that I'd like to bring to your attention, because it really highlights the areas that Ryan is focusing his research on. And that is the area that he spent his academic sabbatical on this past year, returning this summer. The first 6 months were spent in Washington, D.C. It was hosted by the Virginia Tech University's Global Issues Initiative. And while in Washington, Ryan researched primarily in the area of governance of international food aid and international trade agreements. And he spent a lot of time there with regard to with the USDA and an organization called the International Food Policy Research Institute, which is part of the consortium of the CGIAR institutes. And so that started Ryan's sabbatical. The second 6 months of the sabbatical were spent in Rome. You can see this continuing theme in terms of the Department of Economics at Rome Tre University. And there, Ryan taught a course in the graduate program, food security, and he was accessing food data there with regard to the World Food Program, which is located in Rome. And Ryan is part of something called the Transatlantic Food Aid Dialogue Group, the TAFAD group. And they are an international group of academics and food aid practitioners who study food aid policy and governance. And Ryan represented that group at the annual Food Assistance Convention meeting in London in May. I didn't mention to Ryan, I used to attend those about 40 years ago or something in terms of the International Wheat Council Association a long time ago. And so Ryan continues his research on food aid. And, there just may be various connections because this is a big area. And Ryan's continuing that. He's a graduate student in that area and is working with the World Food Program data. And Ryan's current research includes the effects of the agency dependency on aid allocation decisions and the economics of food export restrictions. And one of the things I'd say in terms of Ryan's current other activities is he's the president of the Canadian arm of the International Association of Agricultural Economics. And Ryan and about 3 others put in a bid and got the Canadian or Canada as the location of the triennial international conference, which is a very big conference, 12,000 people attend. And they're going to be holding that in Vancouver in 2018. So with those comments, here's Ryan.
Thank you, Brian. Great, thank you for the introduction. I'm going to do 2 things today. I'm going to start with an overview of supply management and talk about how it works, some of the trade policies involved, some of the pressures that have emerged on supply management. And then I'm going to spend most of the time talking about some research which was mentioned. Brian mentioned it was in collaboration with Chad, who's a professor in our department. And also, he did not mention Di Zhang, who's a PhD student in the Department of Economics, who was a co-author on this paper. And she's being supervised by Chad. So it's a co-authored paper on which I'll be talking today. So the topic that we're going to spend most of the time is the distributional effects of supply management. So I'm largely going to leave aside the production side and the production analysis in this paper. I'm going to talk mostly about consumers and the effects on consumers of different levels of income. Okay, but to do that, I'll have to set it up a little bit and describe how the system works. Okay. And I was asked to mention also, if anyone's interested, the paper on which the research is based is forthcoming. It's not out yet, but if anyone would like to read it, please just send me or Dee or Chad an email, and we can send you a copy. It's not officially printed in the journal yet. Okay, so here's an outline of what I will be discussing. I'll give an overview of supply management, and then I'll spend a few minutes talking about some of the pressures that have emerged on supply management from both outside Canada and inside Canada. And then the rest of the time I'll spend talking about our research. So the first thing we had to do was model consumer behavior for demand for food products. And then we had to, in our research, determine what the market for these products might look like in Canada without supply management. So I'll spend some time describing that. And then I'll get to the results and then close with some discussion. All right, so I presume a lot of you are quite familiar with how supply management works. It applies to dairy, poultry, and poultry production in Canada, chicken, turkey, and eggs. And agricultural commodity prices are inherently volatile. They go up and they go down very quickly and by large amounts in very short periods of time because demand and supply for these products are very inelastic. So the demand and supply curves are quite steep. So we see very large price swings for these products in the market in very short periods of time. So in response partly to these inherently volatile prices, producers of these products convinced the federal government in the 1970s, that started a few years apart for dairy and for poultry, but to implement a system of what's now called supply management. So there are 3 main pillars to supply management. The first is a system of production controls or production quotas. So in order for producers to sell their products to provincial marketing boards, a producer has to hold a production quota, has to have ownership of basically the right to produce and sell this product. And these are very expensive and valuable assets. So to give you an example, these assets can be bought and sold on provincial exchanges. So if you want to expand your production, you have to buy more quota, or you can sell it on exchanges. But as an example, the price of 1 unit of quota for dairy in Manitoba on the exchange in August was almost $29,000 of kilograms of butterfat per day. And that's one lactating cow produces just over 1 kilogram. So a ballpark is about $29,000 per lactating cow. Okay, so if we average that out in Manitoba, the average Manitoba dairy farm I think has about 86 lactating cows, each at a little over 1 kilogram of butterfat per day. So over $2.8 million worth of quota on the average Manitoba dairy farm. So these are very valuable assets, very expensive assets. Okay. Now the idea with these production controls is that they set a hard cap on the amount of these products that can be produced and sold through provincial marketing boards. Okay, so in a competitive industry, we would typically see production set at equilibrium quantities, sort of economics 101, where supply and demand intersect, and we'd have a price, an equilibrium price, where they intersect. In supply management, the quantity is controlled so it stays below that equilibrium quantity of production, right? Otherwise, they wouldn't need production quotas, right? So the idea is, it's debatable how far to the left of QE that QSM is, but the idea is to keep production below what the equilibrium quantity would be otherwise. And we know that as quantity available on the market goes down, the price that consumers pay go up. So we have lower output, higher price. Okay, so that's the first pillar, the production quota pillar. The second pillar is the cost of production pricing. So the provincial marketing boards pay producers for their products a price that is based on a cost of production formula, which, as I was just chatting with Michael somewhere here before we came in, and he's involved in reviewing these cost of production formulas. And they're very complicated. They include all sorts of things like insurance and property taxes and feed for your animals, and plus a producer profit margin. And these get updated regularly, and the price that producers receive for their raw products is based on this cost of production formula. Okay, which is very different than determining the price from the intersection of a supply and demand curve, as we might see in an open market. Now, the third pillar in supply management is really the one that holds it all together, right? So without the prevention of relatively inexpensive imports coming into the country, the production quotas would have no value, right? Because producers just wouldn't be able to sell it at higher prices. So in order to keep these production controls relevant, there needs to be a system to keep imports almost exclusively out of the country. I'll talk about how little bit are allowed in, but most of them are kept out. So traditionally, this was done through a system of import quotas. So import quotas are just a hard cap on the volume of imports that can come into a country, no matter the price. In 1995, Canada signed the WTO agreements, in which member countries agreed to eliminate quotas or quantitative restrictions on imports. And we converted these all to different forms of tariffs. So tariff rate quotas replaced import quotas. Okay, so tariff rate quotas are basically two-tiered tariffs. There's a very low tariff rate on a specified volume of imports. And then once that volume of imports is reached, the tariff rate jumps much, much higher. Okay, and in the case of supply managed products in Canada, this is what they look like. So just by means of example, let's just look at, here's the commodity that we're discussing. So butter, for example, the minimum access, so this is the amount that's allowed in at the low tariff rate. So just over 3,000 metric tons of butter is allowed into Canada at a low tariff rate of about 11 cents per kilogram. Okay. Once that 3,000 metric tons comes in, the tariff rate jumps to an ad valorem tariff, or a tariff as a percent of the value of the product, and that tariff rate is approximately 300%. Okay. So once that minimum access commitment is reached, the tariff rate jumps to 300%. So if you wanted to bring in $100 worth of butter, you would have to pay a $300 tariff or border tax, bring it into Canada and sell it for $400 just to get your money back. So the result of that is that these overquoted tariff rates are prohibitive. We basically don't import anything above these minimum access commitments because the tariffs are so high. Okay, and they range from about 300% is the highest on butter, down to about 154, I guess, is the lowest on turkey. But for all these products, they're very high and prohibitive. So basically, there's no imports beyond the minimum access commitment. And this is really the pillar that holds the whole thing together. Without these import controls, the production quotas would not have any value. And the prices would not be at the same level as they are now. Okay, so the results of supply management, or the outcomes, have been very much in line with the architects of the system. We have certainly not declining prices and rising and high prices for supply managed products in Canada. This is just one quick example. I'm going to come back and talk about prices in more detail later. So the red line is the US price of milk per liter. The blue line, in Canadian dollars converted, the blue line is the Canadian price. I should note here, though, that this isn't an entirely representative comparison because the blue line, Statistics Canada only surveys 1 liter jugs for this data series. BLS surveys 2 liter jugs. So I had to take the 2 liter jug and divide it by 2, which isn't entirely accurate because a 2-liter jug per ounce or per liter is less expensive. So the gap is probably a little bit more narrow than I'm showing here, but I'm going to come back more and talk about prices. But the point remains that the Canadian prices are going up, even once converted to real terms, constant dollar terms. The Canadian series is going up. The American price is sort of hovering around, $1.10 over the past 20 years. We often hear that Canadian prices for supply managed products are stable. I guess it depends on how you would define stable. A statistician certainly wouldn't describe the blue line as stable. It's certainly non-stationary. It's got a fairly high standard deviation. Even once you put it into real terms, it's still trending up. And one result also of this system is that supply management producers typically don't receive the government subsidy programs that other producers receive. So AgriStability and AgriInvest. So to qualify for payments or to trigger payments under these systems, you need to have a shock to your income or your revenue stream of a certain percentage. And supply managed incomes are so stable that they typically don't trigger those payments. So they typically don't receive payments from these types of other government programs. Though we may come back and discuss this at the end, though this doesn't mean that since the government isn't writing checks, there aren't costs to the systems. It's just that they aren't showing up on government balance sheets. So we may talk about that later in the discussion. Okay, so I'm now going to spend a little bit of time talking about some pressures on the supply management. So first I'll talk about the external pressures. These are the ones we hear about most in the press, in the popular press in particular, when there's trade negotiations starting up or ongoing. We recently concluded the CETA negotiations with the European Union, the Comprehensive Economic Trade Agreement. So that's a bilateral agreement between Canada and the US. There was some allowance in that agreement for a small increase in the volume of specialty cheese that can come in at that low tariff rate that I described. The TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership negotiations, are ongoing with a large number of countries. The WTO negotiations, though not quite dead yet, are close to dead, but they still exist, and there are some proposals for Canada supply managed industry in those negotiations. But these types of negotiations are sort of reciprocal deal-making environments. So if the Canadian negotiators are seeking better access to European service markets or better access for Canadian beef products, European negotiators in response will request access to something in our market, right? And usually at the top of that list is better access to markets for our supply managed products. The Europeans want to sell us more cheese, and the Americans want to sell us milk, cheese, and chicken. Okay. So we get pressure from our trading partners, and these things tend to show up in the press. There are also some internal pressures. So industries that use supply managed products as inputs lobby for cheaper inputs, right? As most industries do. So I think they've actually recently changed their name, but there was the Canadian Restaurant Food, CRFA or something, Restaurant Food Association. They actually used to have a website, which I've noticed is now gone, called freeyourmilk.ca. And if you can see what the picture is there, it's a carton of milk inside a little jail cage. And I guess the idea is that we need to bust the milk out of jail so we can have cheaper inputs. So that's one form of internal pressure. Some commentators have also argued that supply managed producers are maybe doing themselves a disservice by capping production and basically not exporting because of potential large export opportunities in Asian markets where demand for animal proteins is going up. So one prominent economist who actually used to work in our faculty and now on staff at Davis, he argues that the producers of these products may be better off by relaxing these production controls, increasing production and exporting to Asia. So that's certainly debatable, but it has been argued. Something more exciting, I'm not sure if anyone saw this, but a few years ago there was an episode of this. This is on the lighter side, by the way, so hopefully you get it. There was an episode of this American crime show, CSI, in which there was a van being driven from upstate New York into Ontario, and there were these packages in the back that contained this white substance wrapped in plastic that everyone assumed was, I think, heroin. And so the drivers were shot, and there was this crime scene investigation. It turns out it was mozzarella cheese, and these guys were smuggling cheese from upstate New York into Ontario to sell to pizzerias. And obviously the guys that shot them thought it was heroin too. I don't think they were hoping to get the rents on the imports for cheese. But it was some interesting notoriety for sort of obscure Canadian policy. I'm going to talk now, I'm going to move on to our research, and I'm going to talk about an entirely different kind of pressure that has received a little bit of play in a little bit in the popular press. Some think tanks have talked about this a little bit, and that is the distributional effects on consumers, specifically the regressive effects on consumers of different income levels in Canada. So a government policy can be considered regressive if it does one or both of two things. So the first is if it transfers income or resources from relatively poor households to relatively rich households. And the second is if it imposes a relatively larger burden on poor households than on higher income households. So just on the first point, I'll just spend a few minutes. It can be considered regressive if it transfers income from a large group of low income to high income. So we have about 13 million households in Canada, most of whom, not all, but most of whom buy some kind of supply managed products. About 7,000 dairy farms and about 1,600 poultry farms. So the average annual income data shake out like this. The average Canadian household income is about, I believe that's about $68,000 per year. The average household income for dairy farms is about 110, 112, I think. And for poultry farms, just under 120. So by that measure, supply management certainly either passes or fails, I guess, depends how you define the test of regressivity. Because on average, it's a transfer of income from, on average, lower income households to higher income households. This is another diagram that shows a similar story. This is household net worth. Average net worth in Canada for a household is about 250, I think, thousand, about $2.75 million for dairy farms and over $4 million for poultry farms. Though when you look at a diagram like this, you have to keep in mind that much of the value of the net worth for dairy and poultry farms is made up of by the quota that I described, right? So without the border taxes, these quotas wouldn't have the same value, and those net worth diagrams would not look like this. So if you see a diagram like the one on the right, just make sure you're interpreting it properly. Okay? Because a lot of that is captured by the value of the production quota, which is completely dependent on the maintenance of the trade barriers. Okay? So that's one test of regressivity. But I'm not going to spend any more time on that. I'm going to describe a different type of regressivity. And to understand this concept of regressivity, I just need to explain a very strong empirical regularity in economics, and that is Engel's law. So Engel's law says that the share of income spent on food declines as income goes up. Okay, so if my income doubles, I will spend more money on food than I do now, but I won't spend twice as much money as I do. Okay, so I may buy a little bit more food, I'll buy more expensive food, but not twice as much. Okay, so we can observe this empirical regularity across households within a country, or you can take averages between countries and compare them across countries. The data in our survey, which I'll describe later, looks like this. We divided our households into 5 income groups, into quintiles, and measured the share of their income that they spend on food. So the lowest income quintile, the poorest fifth of households in our survey data, have incomes of about $15,000 per year. And that's about 1,000 households. We have about 1,000 households in each quintile. They spend 25 to 30% of their incomes on food. Okay? And we can follow that down to the richest, the highest income quintile, earning about $120,000 a year, spending in the neighborhood of 5% of their incomes on food. Okay, so this is fairly typical of what you would see in a very high income developed country like Canada or the US or the United Kingdom. Okay? We often use these Engel coefficients, is what they're called, in the study of developing countries as well. It's a fairly, rough, quick proxy for the state of food security and development of people in poor countries. So in, for example, some sub-Saharan African countries, you can see people with Engel coefficients 60, 70%. Okay, which makes them very vulnerable to shocks to either their incomes or commodity prices. Right? If the price of food goes up a lot and you're spending 70% of your income on food, you can really suffer nutritional shortfalls. And we saw this in 2007 and 2008 when commodity prices went up so much. People in Canada certainly noticed these price increases, but on average, it really didn't cause big nutritional shortfalls, whereas in some other developing countries where these coefficients are much higher, we did see some serious problems. Okay, so the bottom line here is that poorer households spend more of their income on food. So it follows then that any government policy that increases the price of food imposes a relatively larger burden on households at the low end of the income distribution. These folks spending 25 or 30% of their incomes on food. Okay, so of course it imposes a burden on everybody, but as a share of the income, the burden is largest on the poorer households. So what? Oh, sorry, I got ahead of myself there. So what we aim to answer in our research is, it follows that it's regressive, but how regressive? Okay, is it statistically and economically significant? So all of our time really was spent answering this question: how regressive? Okay, so we'll move on. So modeling consumer behavior. This is what we spent most of our time doing in this research. And some of you may have seen efforts in the popular press and in some think tank and some university studies that have tried to estimate how much more Canadian consumers pay because of supply management. Okay, and a lot of these studies, they make economists a little bit uncomfortable because there's no accounting or consideration in these things of consumer behavior. Okay, specifically how consumers respond to price changes. So if there's one thing of which economists are pretty certain, it's that demand functions slope down, right? As prices for products fall, consumers buy more of them. Quantity demanded goes up. Okay, and this is particularly true for food in the case of poor consumers. So low-income households are particularly responsive to price changes for food, for everything, but particularly for food. So what we would expect is if prices for food products go down, low-income households would buy more of them. Everyone will buy more of them, but the percentage change consumed will be more significant for low-income households. And that's really going to be key to the results that we get in our study. Okay, so what we do then in our research is we estimate demand functions for food products. So we control for prices of substitutes and complements, and we have a set of demographic variables and household characteristics. And we're basically estimating, they're more sophisticated than what I've shown you here on the figure with the straight line demand function. But we're basically estimating demand functions for food products for different households. So our data come from the Statistics Canada Food Expenditure Survey. The Food Expenditure Survey has participants keep detailed diaries of their food expenditures. So they literally have a paper diary in which they write down what they purchased, how much of it they purchased, and how much they spent on it. Okay, and they keep the grocery store receipts. So they submit then to Statistics Canada the diary with the receipts. And these diaries are then audited with the receipts. So it's considered a very high quality survey, very reliable data. So we know what they're buying and how much they're paying. We also have very detailed demographic data on all of these households. So we know how much money they make, their annual incomes. We know where they live. We know whether or not they have children and how many children. Urban, rural areas. We have all kinds of demographic information, which I'll show you some of the results from that as well. And very briefly, I'm not going to get into any of the econometrics or the demand modeling here, but very briefly, we use something called the exact-defined Stone Index demand system to estimate consumer behavior, right? And so in economist parlance, those are elasticities. So we estimate how consumers would respond to price changes for food products, and we do this for different types of households across that income distribution that I showed you. So we get different elasticities for each income quintile. Okay? Now I feel I'm doing a disservice to my co-authors here, because the majority of our work was spent doing this one line, but I'm sure you're not as interested in that, so I will move on. Okay, so next piece we needed to do is have an idea of what the market for these products would look like if we did not have supply management. Okay, so we know what the market looks like with supply management. We can observe that. We can go to the store and survey prices. But we don't know what the market would look like without supply management. So what we need to do then is develop what we call a counterfactual model of what prices might be without the current system. Okay? So there are a few ways to do this. One method that is quite popular in studying international trade agreements is the use of simulation models. So these are sets of simultaneous equations for demand and supply functions. And these things, you used to see these lots during WTO negotiations. So if we wanted to know, well, what will be the effect on the Canadian poultry market, prices and quantities, of a 10% reduction in the over-quota tariff rate? And these, I've done a little bit of that in the past. Lots of authors have used these kinds of models. They're useful in that context in the cases of sort of small marginal changes to tariff rates. But they're not particularly useful in our context because we're talking about a very big fundamental change. Right? If we did not have 300% import tariffs on these products, the market in Canada would look very different than it does now. Right? And those kinds of simultaneous equation models aren't good at capturing those kinds of changes. So we took a very different approach. And what we argue is that if we got rid of those 300 or 250% import tariffs, we would basically be looking at a single market for supply managed products, okay, in which consumers and producers would be buying and selling with consumers and producers across the border and in different regions. Okay, so basically we're talking about an open market and free trade of these products between Canada, the US, the European Union, Brazil, etc. Okay? So Canada in a market like that would be quite a small share of total consumption and production. Okay, so Canada consumes and produces less than 10% of what the US does for these products. And once we add in other countries, the share would be even smaller. And what we learned in international economics is that any one segment of the market that has such a small share of production and consumption does not affect the prevailing price. Okay, so we call this the small country assumption. So in this context, Canadian consumers and producers would be, quote, small country, and would be selling and producing in a market in which the price is determined in a larger scale. Okay, so based on that, we argue that Canadian consumers would then face prices similar to what US consumers would face. Okay, and I'm going to qualify this and I'll describe how we do this. But basically, the price would be largely set by world conditions, a lot of which is determined in the US market, which is very large. Canadian consumers and producers would be faced with those prices. Okay? So the way we did this is we chose 4 Canadian cities in which to survey prices for supply managed products. We chose Vancouver, Winnipeg, Windsor, and Montreal, give some regional variation. And we also made sure to choose cities that are very close to the US border. Okay, so all of these cities are within about 100 kilometers of the US border. So this allows us to abstract from issues of transportation costs and storage costs that would push the prices for these products up higher in, say, northern Manitoba. Okay, so I'll describe these prices, and the prices in these cities that I've described are actually lower than in other Canadian cities. I'll come back and talk about that in a minute. So we took the average price for these products across these 4 cities, averaged them, and I'll show you what those look like in a minute. For our US comparator prices, we use data from the Bureau of Labor Statistics. They do regional retail price surveys, the West, South, Northeast, and Midwest. We chose to use the Midwest price average for a few reasons. One is the West has, Alaska and Hawaii, New Mexico. Those prices probably aren't very representative of what consumers in Canada would pay. Same argument for the South. We chose to go with the Midwest instead of the Northeast because prices for these products in the Midwest are actually higher than they are in the Northeast. So we're being very conservative on our US prices. We're basically taking the higher of the US prices against which to compare Canadian prices. So we're being quite conservative. And one point I would like to make as well is that these prices in the US certainly are not determined in a market free of government intervention, right? There are a lot of government policies for dairy and poultry products in the US that affect market prices. Okay? However, whatever happens to Canadian policy with or without supply management, that won't affect the decisions of Congress and USDA in their determination of policy. So we argue that despite the fact that those aren't, quote, free market prices in the US, they are the relevant comparison for what we want to do. Because whatever happens in Canada, US policy is not going to change in response. Okay? So here are our price comparisons. So we looked at these data over 3 years and took the average just to make sure we don't have any anomalies in any one specific year. Those two columns at the second last, the average, those are the average price comparisons that we used. And then the column in the red box, premium, is the prices that we argue that Canadian consumers would face prices for supply managed products that would be lower by those amounts if supply management did not exist. Okay, so there's quite a range here, 15 or 14% for ice cream up to almost 70% for chicken. I think the unweighted average of these was about 38%. So fairly large, but quite variable across products. All right. Now, one thing about these price premiums that we use in our model, first I'd like to emphasize that we believe them to be very conservative. So we've chosen those 4 Canadian cities which are very close to the US border. The prices in Vancouver, Winnipeg, Windsor, and Montreal are lower than prices for these products in neighboring cities. So for example, the price in Winnipeg is lower than in Saskatoon and Regina. The price in Windsor is lower than in Toronto. Montreal is cheaper than Quebec and Ottawa. So we've chosen low representative prices for Canada, and we've chosen high representative prices for the US. Okay, so we were very careful to construct a very conservative price premium for purposes of our model. And the other thing that I will come back to at the end is, even if you disagree with our price premiums, and I'll show you in a minute, I think a lot of people might, our measure of regressivity that I'm going to describe later on is actually not very sensitive to how big those price premiums are. So if they were a little bit bigger or a little bit smaller, the regressivity measure that I'm going to show you later is quite robust. And I'll describe why that is when we get to the end. On the topic of conservative price premiums, I mentioned some other people have tried to do this using different techniques and tried to estimate price premiums. I've just got a few examples here from other studies. So this top one is from Martha Hall Finley at the University of Calgary. She built some price comparisons on milk between Canada and the US, and you can see her premiums are much higher than ours, in the neighborhood of 100%. She was just looking at milk in this study. Colin Kenny, the senator in Ottawa, wrote an op-ed a few weeks ago on supply management. He did the same thing with a number of different products, and you can see his premiums are much, much higher than ours as well, also in the neighborhood of 100% for most products, but not processed cheese, interestingly. The bottom one is completely unscientific, but it's just a photographic snapshot of chicken breast prices at a Safeway in Winnipeg and a grocery store in Utah. And again, the premium there is in the neighborhood of 100%. So this is just to emphasize that the price premiums we use in our study are very conservative. Okay, they're, in all likelihood, they're probably bigger than what we use in our model. But that doesn't necessarily affect the ultimate question we're trying to answer, which is the degree of regressivity. Okay? So let's get to the results. Just to recap the steps we go through to get to our results, ultimately we're trying to answer the question, how does this policy that raises prices, how do the higher prices affect the distributional effects, distributional welfare between consumers? Okay, so the first step is modeling consumer behavior. And for that, we use our demand model to estimate elasticities for different types of households. Okay, from the lowest income quintile up to the highest income quintile. We then generate a counterfactual market in which supply management does not exist, and try and determine what might prices look like in this market, which is what I described in the border price comparisons. We then combine these two pieces and we simulate how much consumers would spend on supply managed products if prices were in fact lower. Okay, so we use our consumer behavioral model to determine how much would they purchase if prices were different. Okay, so this is where we use our elasticities. We then calculate the monetary compensation that's required to make a consumer indifferent between the current system with current prices and a market without supply management in which prices would be lower. Okay, so it follows that we would have to compensate them under the current system because prices are higher to make them indifferent between the two. Okay, and that compensation, it's called compensating variation. It has a technical explanation that I won't get into, but you can understand it basically as the absolute level of burden imposed by the system. Okay, so an implicit tax, the implicit tax that results from supply management. Okay, this doesn't tell us the regressivity story. To do that, we need to take that absolute burden, that implicit tax level, and divide it by household income. And that gives us a relative burden or a tax rate. Okay, so we then have an implicit tax rate imposed by supply management. And as I mentioned, we do this for households at different income levels. Okay, so we do this for all 5 quintiles, and we compare this implicit tax rate across income quintiles. And that gives us the answer to the distributional effects, how regressive. Okay? So these are the steps we go through to get to our results, which I will now start sharing. So very quickly, this is a table of demand elasticities for, we estimated the model for all food products. I've just included the supply management products here. So that second column under aggregate, that is the own price elasticity of demand for, in this case, chicken. So what this tells us is that a 1% increase in the price of chicken leads to just over a 1% decrease in quantity demanded of chicken. And that's averaged across all Canadian households of all income levels. Okay? We also do that estimation for each income quintile. So you can see for the poorest fifth of households, these are the households earning about $15,000 a year, the response is a little bit bigger, just over 1%, 1.13%, and smaller for the highest income households, about 0.9%. And we do this for all our supply management products. And you can see they're quite different for some products. Yogurt, the response is much different, very elastic for poor households, not as elastic for rich households. Cheese, very elastic for, or well, more elastic for poor households, very inelastic for poor households. Very stark difference between the income quintiles for eggs as well. And this is really what we expected to find, because we expect that poor consumers are much more responsive to food price changes than relatively well-off consumers. Okay, so these go into developing our compensating variations that tell us the size of the burden. So here's the table of very interesting results that all that work leads up to. So I'll go through this slowly by means of an example. So this is the compensating variation across our entire sample. So all households, averaged across all households, not controlling for different levels of income, household type, children, etc. What this tells us is that on average, supply management imposes an absolute burden or an implicit tax level of $444 per household per year. Okay? Now, so that's for the entire sample. We do the same estimation for income quintiles. So we have about 1,000 households in each quintile, and we can see for the poorest income quintile, the tax rate is about the tax level is about $340, and that goes up as income goes up, which we expect to see because higher income households spend more money on these products, up to about $550. Okay, so this still doesn't tell the regressivity story. We'll get to that. We also have very detailed demographic data, as I described, and we do the same estimation not only with an income quintile, but for households with and without children. So as Brian mentioned, I've just had a son, and I've learned this lesson, that households with children spend a lot on supply managed products. And you can see that households with children in the lowest income quintile face an absolute burden of about $466, and the richest quintile about $712. And this is a reflection of those households spending more on these products. So households with children typically buy a lot more dairy and a lot more poultry. Okay, so now to answer the regressivity question, we need to include the levels of income for these households. So we have those data from our survey. The average Canadian household income in our survey, which is a little different than that first table I showed you, is about $52,500. And you can see in the different income quintiles, about just under 15 for the lowest and about 120 for the highest income quintile. Now to get the tax rates, or the relative burdens, we just take that $444 and divide it by the household income for that group. So in this case, we take $444 divided by $52,500. we get a burden as percent of income of 0.84%. So this tells us that on average, Canadian households face an implicit tax rate of 0.84% as a result of higher supply managed products. And we do the same estimation across our income distribution. For the poorest households, about 2.3%, and this decreases monotonically up to our richest households, and it's about 0.47% for the highest income households. Again, we do the same thing for households with and without children, about 2.4%, a little bit higher, which we would expect because these households spend more on supply managed products, and down to about 0.5% for the highest income quintiles. So this really tells us the regressivity story. The punchline and the takeaway is the answer to this question. So the effects are regressive. We expected to find that. That wasn't a surprise. But how regressive? Here's the takeaway. The relative burden, or the tax rate, on the poorest households is approximately 5 times as large as it is on the richest households. Okay, so that's the 2.29 divided by 0.47, almost 5. Okay, so how does that compare to other policies? Well, several government policies, for example, income taxes are the opposite, right? They're progressive. So the higher is your income, the higher is your marginal tax rate. This is the converse of that. The higher is your income, the lower is the implicit tax rate of this policy. Carbon taxes have been studied for regressivity as well, and they are certainly regressive, though there was a study that did something similar to what we've done here for carbon taxes in British Columbia, and they were found that the ratio was in the neighborhood of 2 to 2.5 times, so still regressive, but not as regressive. So in the context of other government policies, this would be considered very regressive. One more table of results. I presented this several times in academic seminars, and a few participants asked to see a table that looks like this. So we calculated the absolute burden levels by commodity. So where's the action? Is it in chicken or turkey? And what we found is that it's mostly in chicken, milk, and cheese. 2 reasons for that. One is that that's the largest expenditure share in supply managed products, so people spend a lot of money on that. And the elasticities for these products were quite high, so there's a big price response when prices change. So some discussion of the results. So I mentioned that our price premiums are conservative, and some might argue too conservative. Actually, let me go back. On that point, remember I said that the size of the price premiums will not necessarily affect the measure of regressivity. And what I meant there is that this ratio of 5 won't change very much. So it would change a little bit. But what would change if we had different price premiums are these numbers, right? The absolute burdens. But the ratio of the burden from poorest to richest would not change as much as you might think. So while these price premiums affect the absolute level of burden, they don't have as large effect as you might expect on this measure of regressivity. And this is actually how we measure regressivity. Not the size of the burden on each household, but the ratio between different types of households. So I did mention that we have conservative price premiums. Our welfare effects, we believe, also are quite conservative, and in fact represent low-end bounds for what they really would be. For a few reasons, we don't have in our data set data on food consumed away from home, so we don't have restaurant meals. So if we had data on restaurant meals, the expenditure shares would be even higher, and those burdens would be even larger. But the food expenditure survey just don't have those data, so we couldn't include it. There were some other technical reasons that our welfare estimates were smaller than they would be if we used different techniques. We used compensating variations instead of equivalent variations and consumer surplus, which I won't get into. Our demand system was a partial demand system, meaning it only had food, not recreation and durables and clothing and things like that, which means our elasticities are a little probably smaller than they otherwise might be. So I won't discuss that, but as we argue in the paper, we believe that our welfare estimates and our price premiums are low-end bounds and quite conservative. So going forward, we will probably continue to see pressure coming from external groups on supply management. We're still involved in some trade negotiations, and I'm sure more will start in coming years, bilateral and multilateral. TPP is alive and kicking, WTO not so much. But the reality is the balance of lobbying power for supply managed industries really has not changed in recent years. There is very strong political support for supply management across all political parties. So this quote is taken from a standing committee on international trade. This was leading up to the CETA negotiations from a few years ago. But this was unanimous across all parties at the time. Unequivocal support of and commitment to defend Canada's supply management system, basically as it is. And this is fairly typical of political lobbying. We see sort of small concentrated interest groups that are organized and vocal and influential, and then the 13 million households who are disorganized and don't have as strong a voice are often not as successful. There have been some mention of perhaps including consumer representation on the Canadian Dairy Commission. Some authors from Montreal suggested that. We'll see. I'm not sure if that will happen or not, but I believe I will end there and be happy to take any questions or discussion.
Thank you, Ryan. Go ahead. I was about to say, any questions?
When you listed your average household worth on your example of the dairy, you included the business. So let's say a plumber or a construction company is his business included in his household as well? Or do you only do that for farms?
I don't actually do those data. Those are stats. To be honest, I don't know the answer to that question. I don't know.
Because your disclaimer about the supply managed portion of that household expense would reduce his household down to 400,000.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I don't know if it would go down to 100,000, but it would.
No, 400.
Oh, 400. Yeah. Then it would only be twice the average Canadian household instead
Well,
of 10 times.
Your average is 400.
I think the average was 250, wasn't it?
No, it said 400.
Yeah, I think the Canadian average there is about 240, 250, something like that.
And it would be identical if you remove the business from the household.
Yeah. I mean, the net worth diagram has to be viewed under the caveat that so much of it is made up by that production quota.
So it's the business, not the household.
Yeah.
Okay. Yes. Thank you for your presentation. When the presentation started out, and I had a chance to read it last night, you asked some very interesting questions in terms of trying to link the impacts of supply management on the consuming public. And then the conclusion, if I read it right, what we're talking about at the end of the study is probably equivalent of the cost of a cup of Starbucks coffee every day is what we're talking about. Or the difference between if a consumer bought no name brand products in a grocery store versus Heinz or whatever, that difference is probably more than what we're talking about in terms of the study. But when I look at the study, I look at the questions and trying to link it to or do an assessment on impact on consumers. And then in between that and the results, I try and look at the assumptions and the research to try and understand where we're going and how we get to the results. And I would suggest, I think we need to expand the conversation because I'm not sure that this alone will give us the answers that we're looking for. I happen to be an egg farmer, and I'm always looking for ways to improve our system to provide a continuing better economic product for consumers. And I'll just give you a few examples, and you would be aware of this because of your experience in the introduction back in Washington. Because if I look at the policies, say Canada versus US, in Canada, right or wrong, the tax system is such that the price of eggs, dairy, poultry products is reflected in the price. Whereas in the US, which is not part of this study at all, and I'm most familiar with eggs, of course, they have a school food lunch program, which is paid for by the US government. if they have surplus egg production in the U.S., that volume is exported outside of the U.S., paid for by the U.S. government. So my point is the taxpayers are paying for indirectly the price of eggs or milk or what it is through their tax system as opposed to the price of the product. And it goes beyond that. If you look further at the trade conversations and you know, the debate's ongoing, you mentioned trade discussion several times, and what the U.S. Farm Bill does directly south of us in terms of the Mississippi and the U.S. Corps of Engineers, which again is funded by the U.S. taxpayer, subsidizes the Mississippi, the water for irrigation, for alfalfa and feed grains, for supply managed animals as well as others, is again paid for by the U.S. taxpayer, which isn't included in there. A couple of other things is it'll be interesting to look at, one assumption in the study was that if there was no supply management, I think you mentioned it today, is the opportunity that we would have for exports, and we could grow around the world. And unfortunately, when I look at what has happened to my friends in the hog industry, we're painfully aware that just because the border is open, all of a sudden a neighboring country, in our case the U.S., implements a pool program, which has cost Canada billions of dollars in the last 10 years, which is significantly more than we're talking about in this study. So I'm trying to make the point that we need to expand the study a bit, and even on the values that you use there for quota values, I agree that the cost of being in any business is horrendous, quota or otherwise. But that quota value is only comparable to about 400 acres of land, which today would not be considered a viable grain farm. So I guess my point is we need to be careful how we use the information, and I always try and look for the broadest information possible. Even in the trade negotiations, TPP is the latest one, I hear just as much about automobiles between the US and other TPP countries as opposed to dairy, milk, or intellectual property or anything else. So I guess my point that I'd like to leave with you, which I'd like you to comment on, is a narrow study can give us certain results, but I wonder if they're totally accurate or suitable to a good research project when there's other implications in the economy of whatever country it is. Thank you.
Okay. Do you want to take a few, or can I?
No,
That's
go
a lot.
ahead.
Okay.
Give us some native answers.
Sure. Okay. Well, your first comment about whether or not is that big a deal? You know, that wasn't my intention to decide. Well, it is or is not a big effect for specific households. But I think, you know, if you were to try and argue to an urban household that's making $15,000 or $20,000 a year that a government policy is imposing a tax of $466, you know, I think they may not be too happy about that. Maybe you're right, but these people probably aren't buying Starbucks every day, and they probably aren't buying brand name food. So I'll just finish. Yeah, thank you. So that's to that point about this. I mean, it's completely subjective whether or not you think these are large or small numbers. But the point is that they're regressive, right? That was the point of our study. Okay. The second, I guess you made quite a few points towards the end there in comparing U.S. farm policy to Canadian farm policy. You know, we don't do that in this paper. Obviously, we're focusing completely on consumer effects. There are a number of ways if policymakers and voters decide that they want to transfer resources and income from one group of people to another group of people. In this case, it's on average from urban consumers to rural producers. There are a number of ways to do that. This is one way to do it. Okay. What we've done in this paper is said if the policy decision is taken to do that, this is one of the costs of doing it. Okay. There are a number of other ways to do it. It's done very differently for our other industries. Agri-Stability and Agri-Invest operate very differently. Those programs certainly have a range of different effects that we study and I teach in my policy courses. They're typically funded through income tax, which is a progressive tax system. So, I mean, that's an entirely different research topic, comparing, and in fact we do that and I teach some of that as well, comparing the effect on the overall economy of a system like this that reduces production and increases prices to a system that basically just subsidizes producers. And we can show how the costs and what we economists call deadweight losses. We can compare them between these two types of systems. And I don't want to get into that here, but a system like this, besides the regressivity, does impose larger net costs on the economy because it creates this deadweight loss through higher prices and lower production. And you know, there's this misconception that because the government isn't writing the checks, there's no cost on the economy, and that's certainly very far from the truth. And in terms of the U.S. taxpayer, as I mentioned, you know, you're right. The USDA has a range of policies that distort the market, and taxpayers pay for a lot of these, and that's the way the world is. I'm not arguing whether or not that's right or wrong. I'm just saying this is the system in Canada. This is what it might look like without that system. These are the costs. So do we want to move on, Martin? Is that?
I agree with you in the sense that
Harold, if we can get down a few points. Go ahead.
I'm wondering if I go to the US and if I buy tires or books or whatever, I generally find them cheaper. So I'm wondering if you did a similar study with non-supply management food products, would you get the same results? Have you looked into that at all?
We did not, but the premiums would be very different. So you know, the price premium on wheat-based products and beef-based products would be much, much smaller. There may be a premium, and so many of these things are regional, right? So even within Canada, there's quite large regional price variation. But the margins for these products are particularly high. But we didn't look at any, just food products.
I suspect that a lot of food products, fruit, vegetables, whatever, I mean, because they have some transportation.
Right.
They might be higher, the same as supply management products are higher, so that's
Right,
why I'm
but
asking.
the key to our study is for things like fruits and vegetables that perhaps are grown in South America or the southern US, prices in northern Manitoba would certainly be higher because there's very high transportation costs. Those are real market costs. The point here is that these aren't real market costs. These are costs imposed by a government policy, right? So what we're measuring is the effects of the government policy, not market costs. Of course, every household, whether it's poor or rich, pays more for vegetables in northern Manitoba than they do in Florida, but not because of government policy.
So the next point I was going to make is if you're checking border cities, that those costs should be similar, so.
Yeah, that's why we do border cities.
Maybe 3 comments and a question at the end. In dairy farming, I've been a dairy farmer for 35 years, so when you talk about assets of 2.8 million, I'm close to the average in a sense, but when my sons want to take over, I just can't tell them, well, here's a 2.8 million, can you get buy-in? So I kind of transfer it to the farm that is going to be there for generations to come. So it may look like a value, but in a sense it's in the books. I just want to say too that the growth allowance, you kind of talked at the beginning about, we talked about we need to communicate each other, so that's what we're doing here. You talked about we kind of restrict growth allowance, and that's not totally true. We have set in the last 2 years what I call a 2% growth allowance so that we can meet any demand that's out there, and we even have special prices for innovation products. So I think we're trying to stay ahead of the curve so that any growth that needs to be done in Canada can be done. About the household choices, the way people decide to eat, hopefully it's health and nutrition first, that's what we hope, but we are not much in control of, you know, what are they eating and what are their choices. The question I wanted to leave you was assumption of if we let supply management drop, we're assuming that all the retail prices are going to drop and consumers will benefit. I think we've got to take a good hard look because it's been existing in the world in countries over the pond that have lost supply management. And I don't think the benefit for consumers had that nice big drop which you'd like to see. For some reason or other, the retail price remains. The farmer is dire straight and they become factory farms if they can because the family farms start dropping off. They're trying to be a factory farm to compete with the world prices. And I don't know if that's what consumers really want. Just my comments. And I'm just saying, assumption, you're assuming that consumer prices will drop because supply management will drop.
Yeah, so I'll respond to those. You know, the first one, I get this question a lot in some of my policy classes, and you read this kind of statement in supply management literature by the producer groups, that producers increase quota to meet demand. And meeting demand is a very odd thing to say to an economist. I mean, the only place you meet demand here is where supply and demand intersect, right? And if we were doing that, we wouldn't need production quotas and 300% tariffs. So, I mean, the proof is sort of in the fact that we have these 300% tariffs. The production is undoubtedly lower than what would exist without it. I mean, I don't think too many people would argue that. even proponents of the system. Second, let's see. No, yeah, you mentioned that not in control of what people eat and their nutritional. No, I mean, of course not, other than we know that consumers respond to price. And I'm not making any claims here about nutritional benefits or health benefits of consuming different products. I'm just saying that if prices were lower, people would buy more of them. Whether that's good or bad is beyond the reach of this study. Okay? And you mentioned experiences in other countries. Probably New Zealand is in your mind. New Zealand had a different system. They didn't have production quotas, but they did unravel their support system. New Zealand was always an exporter of dairy products, and after unraveling the system, they became a bigger exporter of supply managed products. And anytime I talked about the small country assumption, New Zealand is a small country, they're suddenly exporting in the world market and world demand goes up. The price that New Zealand consumers face went up, right? But they were already producing below that world price. The difference is Canada is now producing much above that world price. So New Zealand went this way, Canada would go the other way. We're in very different circumstances. Yeah. Yeah, and there are other issues that I didn't get into here about retail prices. You know, there are issues of concentration in the processing and the retail stages. A lot of research has been done on that. But we have same issues in the US, which is where we get our comparative price. So.
You know, ask you, is there any hope that this supply management will be modified very soon, or is we are accustomed to this thing that no movement on this?
So what was the first part of the question?
Is there any hope that there will be movement?
Hope?
Yeah.
I guess hope is very subjective. It depends who you are. We don't take a position in this paper on what we think should or my personal view is that not much will change anytime soon. All political parties are on board. You know, as I mentioned in the CETA negotiations, there was an allowance for a small increase in specialty cheeses to come in at that low tariff rate. But it's a very small amount, and the amount of raw milk that is used to produce that cheese is very small. So that really will not affect the fundamental structure of the industry. The TPP negotiations, I mean, I could be totally wrong, and they'll say, yeah, we're buying out all the quota tomorrow, but I don't foresee that.
Right.
Ryan, one interesting aspect we haven't had much discussion on is the question of price variability, you know, which was a big selling point with the big variable prices in the 60s. And a friend pulled me up last night. He'd just been traveling around, and he always asks me after he comes from the United States, why are milk prices so much cheaper in the United States than in Canada? And last night he asked me, what in the world happened to milk prices in the United States? They're more expensive in the United States right now than Canada. And you have it there. And the Canadian side definitely is, it increases very smoothly. And the question of price variability, it always struck me, and I think people like Mr. Yursky, who's actually the minister in Manitoba during the time that supply management was formed. The stability of prices was a very big deal. Is there any way of measuring that? Because there's no question that the value of stable prices is likely a lot higher to low-income families than it is, you know, for people like ourselves.
Yeah. So just to the point of the value of stable prices, again, it's very important that you are clear on your definition of stable, right? So, you know, by statistical definition, the U.S. price here is much more stable, right? And it's much lower. So, you know, if you wanted to argue that low-income consumers would prefer the blue line to the red line, you know, that would be a tough argument to make. It's not quite that simple, but, and the other issue is a much more technical economic theory argument on the benefits to consumers of, quote, stable prices. And there is research on that. A lot of it was done in response to these high prices in 2007 and 8. And what was found is that consumers actually don't value stability as much as you might think. There was some interesting empirical work done in Ethiopia, and some has been done in Canada theoretically too on who actually benefits from price stability. It's kind of technical to get into today. I'm not going to show it, but you know, you can do it diagrammatically in a supply and demand graph. I teach it in my policy course. So even if you were to believe that and argue that there is a benefit to price stability at a much higher price versus price volatility at a much lower price would be a tough comparison to make.
Just one comment while you have that. I mean, it's gone up 12% in 20 years in the US. How is that sustainable? I mean, is there
What does sustainable mean?
well, what are the economic and social costs, or has there been results or analyses done of the economic and social
Yeah.
costs associated with this economically depressed price? Because it has to be economically depressed if you compare.
Sure. I mean, if you put this in real terms, constant dollar terms, the U.S. price might actually be a little bit lower now than it was 20 years ago. The real price, right? Now that's largely a reflection of both economies of scale and production costs actually going down. So producers are becoming more efficient, so they can still run a business and make money on these operations. The difference in Canada is the cost of production formula that I described really never comes down in line with efficiency gains. So in the US, efficiency gains leads to more production, pushes price down. In Canada, efficiency gains just kind of get absorbed in that producer profit part of the cost of production formula, because the cost of production formula doesn't go down. Producers never get a lower price because they become more efficient. Whereas in the US they do.
Derek.
If you want to look back at Phil Parney's presentation on the craft, I think it's still online. He shows that the long-term food prices have been on a downward trend because overall agriculture's gotten so efficient. So that's kind of to your point. But can you put your graph of this quota shift there?
You want the supply shifting out thing? Is that where you're
Yes,
going
that
here?
one right there. Yes.
This one, yeah, okay.
And maybe you and me shouldn't talk too much about this because
Okay.
we don't have nothing to talk about in coffee. But when you have the shift, the
So do you want to just tell people what you're talking about here? Or?
because I think you and I have argued over whether or not the supply function stays the way it is.
Argue about how much it should be.
Yeah, well, there's two things though. You just said that the fact that there is a tariff rate quota that's keeping out U.S. milk is proof that there wasn't much of a supply shift. But if the Canadian supply function, if it's more inefficient to produce milk up here, our supply function might be pretty high up, and the reduction in risk could shift it down so that we actually have to have the quota because we have a reduction in variation. It's possible.
Right, but the idea then is if the supply, I'm sorry if this is getting a little technical, but if the supply shifts down enough, the market price is going to come down, right?
No, the price is being driven by the quantity we've held against your demand functions, which you've got great demand functions now, but they're not being, that quantity's set, and that's what's setting the price, right? Supply
But
is.
Yeah. Okay. Maybe this is a little time. Let's.
One in the back, and then one last question. Sorry, Derek.
Thank you. I'm a chicken farmer, so I'll limit my comments to the chicken industry. And so we've talked a lot about price variability, and we've talked about the variability from the north side of the border to the south side of the border. But just recently, in April of this year, we did a study in the city of Ottawa only with 9 major retail chains. And we found the price variability to vary as much as 250% for like products during the same 3-day period. So when we say that farmers don't set retail prices, we mean that. We don't understand this variation. We do conclude that whatever the market will bear, the industry will take. The assumption that as soon as we take out supply management and there's supply there that the consumers will benefit, I think is an assumption that may be in error. I realize we build on assumptions sometimes. But the other thing is that we talk about limiting supply, and again, for chicken, the comment was made earlier where you said we keep almost exclusively foreign product out of the country. We referred earlier to the TPP negotiations, and it just so happens that Canada imports more chicken than 6 of the TPP countries combined. The US, Australia, Peru, Malaysia, Brunei, and New Zealand combined. Canada imports more chicken than all of these countries combined. What effect has that had on our pricing at the consumer level? You know, we've argued that as well. We've taken, at the farm gate, we've taken a lot of hit in regards to the blame for whatever the prices do. The farm gate price must be to blame. We maintain that it isn't. Industry wants to buy low, sell high. And the other item is that, as was mentioned by someone earlier, and that is that our input costs, whether they're other materials, cost more in Canada as well, and so do the input costs to produce our chicken. Whether we buy feed or fuel for heat, whatever it is, we're paying a cost that is greater. Fuel trucks drive by our doorstep heading south of the border. We could buy that same fuel cheaper. Fertilizer to produce the crops that we purchase feed with. Potash mined in Saskatchewan running by our doorstep is sold cheaper to American farmers than it is to Canadian farmers. So the list goes on. Our inputs are higher than the American inputs, and so I think it's overly simplistic to say, well, it's supply management that is the driver here for the higher prices. Thank you.
Okay. So I think I jotted down 3 points here. One is you said that our result that consumers benefit is an assumption. It's not an assumption. That's actually the main result of the model. So that's what the whole point of the research was. Assumptions are sort of pieces that you put into the model to arrive at the results. The result is the benefit for consumers. So just a clarification, that's not an assumption. Second, you mentioned that primary producers don't control the retail price, which is absolutely true. Primary producers receive the cost of production price from provincial marketing boards. The provincial marketing boards then sell these products to processors and end users through negotiations. And there's a lot of research by some colleagues of ours at Laval and now at FCC who have analyzed just that, the concentration in these other stages of the supply chain that affect retail prices. And of course, retail prices are affected by local market conditions in different cities. And so, yeah, there's certainly no claim here that primary producers control the ultimate retail price other than at the early stage in which the price is higher than it otherwise would be. And as to your point about input costs being higher in Canada than the US, that's certainly may be the case. But that doesn't really bear any light on our point here. Our point is that if production costs in Canada are higher, and we went to an open market in which consumers and producers traded across borders, if production costs were so much higher in Canada and producers couldn't compete, we would be importing a lot more, right? And a lot of those imports would come from the US and from perhaps New Zealand and the European Union, but the point is the prices would be lower, whether or not input costs here are higher or lower. That's sort of irrelevant to our point. Our point is that without the system, consumers would be paying a lower price, right? Some of it might be produced in Canada, some of it might be produced in the US, but the point is this is how it would play out for consumers. So I'm certainly not arguing on differences in input costs. That's
one final question.
I'm just curious. I'm a U-bound grad and English student, and I'm also an employee of U-bound, and I come from a farm family. So I guess I just want to make a couple of comments on the language that you used in your paper. You kind of state, or I think you stated at a certain point, that you're not taking a position in this paper. However, I would suggest that from your title, it sounds very much like you're taking a position. And not only are you taking a position, you kind of are starting with very narrow economic terms and language and moving them into a very rhetorical kind of almost inflammatory type language. So I just had a comment about that. I thought that was a kind of interesting use of language, kind of goes from one register to another, and was maybe used in a sort of, I mean, to me it almost seems as if you're beginning with a certain ideological position and your arguments are following from that. So I just had a comment on the language. I'm just wondering how you, I guess, came up with the title of the, I mean,
sure.
Certainly it's
so are you referring to
a lot of people.
It's interesting you bring that up. So are you referring to the first part of the title or the last word of the title?
All of it.
All of it. Okay, so the word regime, actually,
no, not regime.
Okay, well, just so I did get a comment on the use of the word regime a while ago, and just to give some context on that, like you said, it's sort of an economic term, and economists use that all the time, right? Fixed exchange rate regime, variable exchange rate regime, free trade regime. So we use it all the time. So, and this is published in an economics journal. So our audience is used to it. So it's not a loaded word in the context of economics.
Like regressivity, I guess. You know,
Yeah.
being a very restrictive economic term, you put that into the public discourse, it becomes a very different, it has a very different connotations, I guess.
Well, I don't know if I agree with that. I think, I mean, that's how we measure it. It's regressive policy. It's a very, in the analysis of these types of public policies, that's the term that's used. So if I used a different word, it would not get the point across. Perhaps the word regime caught people off guard, but it's very typical and commonly used in economics. And regressivity, I mean, it's used in the studies of carbon taxes, income taxes, perhaps not in the English literature, but in the analysis of public policy, it's used all the time. I mean, regressivity is a standard term. Yeah, we certainly received more attention for this than most of our stuff, which has been some good and some bad, but it certainly has received some attention. So,
Thank you for the attention you've given.
nice one. All right, thank you. Thanks.